Hello everyone and welcome back to Their Own Words.
History from those who lived it.
My name is Danny.
And I'm Ava.
And today we're going to be talking about purportedly the world's first computer programmer, Ada Lovelace.
She was born in December of 1815, and the reason she's so noteworthy is that she's credited with having written the world's first computer algorithm. Ada Lovelace is the daughter of Lord Byron, who is the famous poet of the Romantic era who wrote many famous works, including Don Juan. She didn't really know her father, though, as he split from her mother shortly after she was born, so just within a few weeks.
She's sometimes called the Enchantress of Numbers, a moniker she received from her friend and collaborator Charles Babbage. Babbage was a Victorian inventor who created what he called a, quote, calculating engine. She corresponded with him regularly, and without Babbage, really there would be no Ada. She saw his difference engine in 1833, as it would become known, at his house at a dinner party, and she became extremely interested in computing. Ada would eventually become so influential that even Alan Turing of Enigma fame referred to some of her notes when breaking the German code machine in the 1940s. Turing coined the term Lady Lovelace's objection, which referred to the principle that an AI, artificial intelligence, can't originate anything, only draw from other things. She was acquainted with some of our other famous Victorian figures, like Charles Dickens, Florence Nightingale, and Michael Faraday. So the analytical engine paper, which Ada is most famous for, this was actually written by someone who attended one of Charles Babbage's lectures in Torino, Italy. So Babbage spoke on this analytical engine that he was planning to create, and this Italian guy who was there wrote it down, and Ada appended her notes to this paper. But that analytical engine was never built until 2002, when some researchers got together and built it, and it worked as Charles had originally intended, which is pretty incredible.
Sadly, she died at the age of 36, the same age as her father, and thus her scientific career was cut dramatically short.
It's actually quite interesting that they both died at the same age, and they were both sort of prolific in their field, her father as a poet and her as a computer scientist.
And I think she's so remarkable because she was a woman in science at a time when women were not doing things like this.
Absolutely, she was a remarkable person. So what we're going to read for you today is some of the notes from her seminal work that she's most famous for, this Notes on the Analytical Engine. And then we'll also get into some letters that she wrote to Charles Babbage, her collaborator. So just for some context here, the difference engine, which Ada saw at Charles's place, and that's what kind of got her interested in computers initially, was able to do one type of calculation or function, served one type of function. The analytical engine, on the other hand, which we talked about was never built, was meant to do a variety of functions. And this is the key point that Ada stresses in one of the excerpts we're going to read for you here, is the difference between these two things. So when Charles was giving this lecture in Torino, and this paper was initially recorded, he was making the case for why the analytical engine, which would be capable of much more than his previous invention, should be built. And Ada appends her notes to that. So here's what she says. The analytical engine is an embodying of the science of operations constructed with peculiar reference to abstract number as the subject of those operations. The difference engine is the embodying of one particular and very limited set of operations.
She goes on to say, the difference engine can, in reality, as has already partly been explained, do nothing but add, and any other processes, not excepting those of simple subtraction, multiplication, and division, can be performed by it only just to that extent in which it is possible, by judicious mathematical arrangement and artifices, to reduce them to a series of additions. The analytical engine, on the contrary, can either add, subtract, multiply, or divide with equal facility, and performs each of these four operations in a direct manner, without the aid of any of the other three. This one fact implies everything, and it is scarcely necessary to point out, for instance, that while the difference engine can merely tabulate and is incapable of developing, the analytical engine can either tabulate or develop.
So this is key to point out here. When she's talking about developing, she's talking about, in essence, thinking. a computer actually doing more than simple arithmetic?
She goes on to say, the former engine is in its nature strictly arithmetical, and the results it can arrive at lie within a clearly defined and restricted range, while there is no finite line of demarcation which limits the powers of the analytical engine. These powers are coextensive with our knowledge of the laws of analysis itself, and need be bounded only by our acquaintance with the latter. The analytical engine does not occupy common ground with mere calculating machines. It holds a position wholly its own, and the considerations it suggests are most interesting in their nature, in enabling mechanism to combine together general symbols in successions of unlimited variety and extent. A uniting link is established between the operations of matter and the abstract mental processes of the most abstract branch of mathematical science. A new, a vast, and a powerful language is developed for the future use of analysis, in which to wield its truths so that these may become of more speedy and accurate practical application for the purposes of mankind than the means hitherto in our possession have rendered possible. Thus, not only the mental and the material, but the theoretical and the practical in the mathematical world are brought into more intimate and effective connection with each other. We are not aware of its being on record that anything partaking in the nature of what is so well designated the analytical engine has been hitherto proposed or even thought of as a practical possibility any more than the idea of a thinking or of a reasoning machine.
Yeah, so she says here, the so well designated analytical engine, because it is analytical, it is thinking. This is really phenomenal because she's talking about computers and how computers can help mankind. And this is 200 years ago. This is way before we actually get computers, but she's conceptualizing this, her and Charles. And it's fascinating to me that the machine that they had conceptualized, which wasn't built, did end up working as they'd intended it to. And I wonder how much farther along we'd be today had that worked out back then.
Well, and I think that she knew that they didn't have the infrastructure to make this possible at the time, because she says it's developed for the future use of analysis. And then she says, and accurate practical application for the purposes of mankind than the means hitherto in our possession have rendered possible. So it's as if she's saying that they don't have, or haven't thus far had, the material capacity to make something like this come into physical existence.
Right, so in this case, maybe that's what she means, is that they don't quite have the capability. I'm not sure, but that's a good point to note.
So next we're going to read to you a letter from Ada to Charles, dated 10th of July 1843. It's very significant because it's the first time that the principle of the computer program had been set out in writing. So she says, "It appears to me that I am working up the notes with much success, and that even if the book be delayed in its publication a week on, it would be worth Mr. Taylor's while to wait." So Mr. Taylor is the name of one of their publishers, Richard Taylor, and he was also a scientist. The publishing company was called Taylor and Francis, and it was located in London. She goes on to say, "I want to put in something about Bernoulli's numbers in one of my notes as an example of how an implicit function may be worked out by the engine, without having been worked out by human head and hands first. Give me the necessary data and formulae. Yours, AAL."
So yeah, here she's describing an algorithm that the machine could potentially execute. And Bernoulli's numbers is the example that she gives, a formula that the machine could compute. She really does have a brilliant mind, and she knows this. She even writes in one of her letters to her mother in 1841, she says, quote, "I believe myself to possess a most singular combination of qualities, exactly fitted to make me preeminently a discoverer of the hidden realities of nature," end quote. That's an incredibly prescient comment to make about yourself. But it's like you said, Ava, she knew that we maybe didn't have the capabilities to do these things, but she had an incredible brain and was able to picture them in the future. She also seems to be keenly aware of her father's legacy and wanting to recognize that and do something almost to maybe remedy part of his sullied reputation. And she writes in another letter to her mother, she says, "Although it is impossible for me to think of my father's memory with feelings of respect or veneration, I believe I have derived from him the flower of his characteristics, and cannot but think on this with pleasure. For his genius and superiority in certain ways were unquestionable. I once told you that I have an ambition to make a compensation to mankind for his misused genius. If he has transmitted to me any of that genius, I would use it to bring out great truths and principles. And in this instance, the truths and principles that she's most passionate about, that she's been passionate about essentially her whole life, is mathematic truths and principles. And I think she really gets this sense that she has genius because her father was so renowned as a genius poet. So she comes by it honestly. But pushing Ada's self-confidence to one side for a second, there is still also a sense that she maybe needs to bring Charles Babbage on side or convince him of her genius, because in this same year we also get a letter from her to Babbage that really underplays her abilities or her confidence that she has in herself. So we'll read that next.
My dear Babbage, I am very anxious to talk to you. I will give you a hint on what. It strikes me that at some future time, it might be even within 3 or 4 years, or it might be many years hence, my head may be made by you subservient to some of your purposes and plans. If so, if ever I could be worthy or capable of being used by you, my head will be yours. And it is about this that I wish to speak most seriously to you. You have always been a kind and real and most invaluable friend to me, and I would that I could in any way repay it, though I scarcely dare so exalt myself as to hope, however humbly, that I can ever be intellectually worthy to attempt serving you.
So this is a vast contrast between the way she writes to her mother about her intellectual capabilities.
Yeah, and I wonder if the way that she talks to Babbage is a result of the fact that he's such a renowned expert in the field. It's like how when you're the expert in the room, as she would be with her family, you tend to be more blunt and more confident in your own abilities, especially when the people around you know nothing about your field of expertise. But yet, when she's in the presence of Charles Babbage, who is this preeminent expert, she's obviously going to take on a more kind of subservient or humble disposition toward him.
That's true. And I think something about wanting to work with someone who, like you said, is an expert, you want to present yourself as sort of a pair of willing hands rather than someone who comes off as a know-it-all. So she just offers herself as is and doesn't make any bold statements about her abilities.
And yet this letter actually stands in stark contrast to the letter we're going to read to you next. It seems that in 2 years she has become even more confident in her abilities, even within the presence of Charles Babbage. So this next letter is from 1843, and it is written to Charles Babbage, and it takes on quite a different tone. She says, I am half beside myself with hurry and work. I could not get anything done in time to send by coach this morning, and now I am obliged still to retain one sheet, which, however, I hope to send you by an occasion tomorrow afternoon. Note B has plagued me to death, although I have made but little alteration in it. Such alterations as there are, however, happen to have been very tiresome, and to have demanded minute consideration and very nice adjustments. It is a very excellent note. I wish you were as accurate and as much to be relied on as I am myself. You might often save me much trouble if you were, whereas you in reality add to my trouble not infrequently, and there is at any rate always the anxiety of doubting if you will not get me into a scrape, even when you don't. I hope you do not take upon yourself to alter any of my corrections. I must beg you not. They all have some very sufficient reason, and you have made a pretty mess and confusion in 1 or 2 places, which I will show you sometime, where you have ventured in my MS's to insert or alter a phrase or word, and have utterly muddled the sense.
This is positively condescending compared to, oh, please, will you use my brain? I want to be your worker and your helper. Yeah. Now the dynamic is flipped.
It's as if she's realized she's some genius and she thinks Charles Babbage is an idiot in comparison to her now. I mean, the very fact she says, I wish you were as accurate and as much to be relied upon as I am. I cannot imagine saying that to a friend or a colleague. But she is very confident in her own abilities, and she believes them clearly to be superior to those of her contemporaries. And she's markedly grown in this self-assurance since the letter that we read to you before that she wrote to Babbage in 1841. This kind of attitude seems very counter to the narrative of women in Victorian eras. not only were they seen by everyone else as the weaker, more inferior sex, especially intellectually, but the attitude of Victorian women themselves would rarely assume such a confident and even arrogant manner. And not only this, but she also takes to essentially disparaging Charles Babbage and his own capabilities in comparison to hers. She speaks as if she doesn't trust him to be as capable as she is. It kind of reminds me of when you're doing a group project with a bunch of inept people and you feel like you have to do all the work because you don't trust anyone else to touch it. And even if they're willing to help, you're like, please don't do anything. You're just going to make it worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. But it almost has a bit of an aristocratic bent to it as well. I think given the context of her talking about her father, and she feels his greatness really thrust upon her. Yeah. And I think there may be an element of that here where it's, I come from greatness and maybe you don't. And the letter from before in 1841 kind of strikes me almost as this Trojan horse thing, because like you said, women weren't really regarded, especially in mathematics. And so she kind of uses this as a gateway to start collaborating more closely together, because I think they'd known each other for years. They'd maybe been collaborating in some kind of informal sense. But then she totally flips the dynamic and becomes the boss.
And Lovelace and Babbage actually did have a minor falling out when the notes on the analytical engine were published, because he tried to add in his own statement. It was some kind of criticism of the government's treatment of his engine. And he tried to add this own statement into the papers without signing it. So there was concern by Ada that this would be mistakenly interpreted as being accredited to herself as well as to Charles Babbage, and she didn't want to be associated with that. So the notes on the analytical engine were published in 1842, so they would have had their falling out around this time. And the letter that I just read to you is from 1843. So it's possible that she's like, please don't alter any of my notes because you've already done something like this before and you can't be trusted.
Yeah, she's a bit snippy here, but in the example you mentioned where someone feels like they're doing all of the work, that's probably a typical reaction.
Yeah, but then is she doing all the work? Because as we know, Charles Babbage was the inventor of the computer. So it's hard for me to believe that he's the equivalent of the kid in the group project that's slacking and doing no work at all, or whatever work he does do is incompetent.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. We may be overestimating her role here a little bit and not giving Charles Babbage the recognition that he's due. He's the guy who invented the machine. He's the guy who sort of got her interested and got her involved, and he obviously has a big role to play here.
Yeah, and this ties into a little bit of the controversy over the nature and magnitude of her contributions. There is, among the academic community, or there has been, some dispute over how important she was in terms of contributing to the analytical engine. There are people who think that she didn't actually contribute as much as it is told in history. As well, there are people who say that she over-exaggerated her genius and other people over-exaggerated her genius.
Yeah, I remember reading somewhere that there was debate over whether or not she actually wrote the notes on the analytical engine. I think that seems preposterous to me. Obviously, from the way they communicate with each other, her and Babbage, it seems she was quite intricately involved. So I do think she wrote the notes, but perhaps her role in this historical narrative has been slightly inflated.
Yeah, and I think it is important to acknowledge that it's not just a straight cut narrative, that there is dispute in the academic community about how much she contributed or about how much of a genius she actually was. But it's also important to note that Babbage himself thought very highly of Ada Lovelace, and he is the one who called her the Enchantress of Numbers. So if he's calling her this, clearly she has something, right? She has some kind of genius intellect.
Well, with that being said, that seems like a good place to end our episode on Ada Lovelace. Thank you guys for tuning in. As always, if you have questions, comments, or concerns, you can reach us at theirownwordspod@gmail.com.
And tune in next week where we will be discussing the life and works of Charles Darwin.